I never imagined that an Easter afternoon would end with me sitting in a hospital waiting room, my shirt damp with spilled wine and a thin red line across my eyebrow, while my thumbs typed 4 words to my lawyer. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which country you're watching from. Let's see. My name is Edward Hale. I'm 70 years old. For most of my life, I taught social studies at the local high school. Nearly 4 decades of chalk dust, reluctant teenagers, and late-night marking. I loved it. I loved the small victories. A student who suddenly cared about a battle in a textbook, a class that finally connected a map to a person. Retirement happened slowly, then all at once. Patricia, my wife of 45 years, and I sold our little townhouse and moved into a modest bungalow lined with maples down by the river in Lakeshore. Our daughter Pauline lives in Calgary and works in software. She visits when she can. Our son Aaron died many years ago. Cancer took him when he was 37, and his absence is a quiet room in our lives I don't like to walk into. My mother, Agnes, is 86. Sharp almost to a fault for most of her life. She taught me how to tie my shoelaces and how to argue politely with officials at the post office. But around 2 years ago, we noticed things beginning to fray. Small lapses at first. Mislaid keys, a forgotten appointment, calling me by my father's name. Once she left the kettle on the hob and filled the kitchen with steam before anyone smelled smoke. Her doctor called it early cognitive decline. Not dramatic, not sudden, but there. Enough that living alone felt suddenly risky. No one in the family could take her in. Pauline's condominium was cramped and expensive, and there had been distance between mother and daughter for years after an argument about something neither of them remembers clearly now. So one autumn afternoon, after a long talk over tea, Patricia and I agreed to bring Agnes to live with us. I remember the day we moved her in, the first week of November. The light was flat and respectful, the way late year light is in Lakeshore. We set up the spare room, the one that had been Aaron's, with her favorite chair, the framed photographs, her bedside lamp, the quiet rug she'd always liked. Patricia bought new curtains. I picked up the recliner from the thrift store. Everything felt right. For a while, life settled into a rhythm that was, frankly, comforting. I made breakfast most mornings, porridge for Agnes, toast for Patricia, whatever eggs I fancied. Agnes would call out answers to quiz shows, clap at wheel, and sometimes tell the same story 3 times in the span of a single meal. I listened like a man hearing an old record he loved. Patricia worked part-time, doing medical billing at a clinic 3 days a week. She had her book circle and her watercolor sessions on Thursdays. I was home most days, happy to knit myself into the new pattern. Then, slowly the tone shifted. Agnes began sleeping later. At first I blamed the change of place, a new bed, a rearranged day. She started losing weight. Not quickly, but in ways you noticed, the hollows beside her cheekbones, the collarbones that seemed to sit closer to the surface. I found a camera at an electronics store downtown. Nothing special, just a tiny motion sensor model, meant for pet owners who want to see what their cats are doing when they're out. The salesman told me it could record in low light and had a built-in memory card. I nodded like a man buying batteries. My heart thudded in my ears while I paid. That evening, while Patricia watched television, I pretended to be fussing with the router in the hallway. The camera was small enough to fit in my palm. I set it high on the bookshelf facing the corridor that led to my mother's room. I told myself it was ridiculous, an old man indulging paranoia. But once it was up there, I felt both foolish and oddly calm. At least I'd know. The first night, it caught nothing unusual. Just Agnes turning over in bed, soft snores, the faint hum of the heater. The second night, the battery died early. I almost gave up. On the third night, a Thursday in mid-February, it captured what I'd been too afraid to imagine. At 2 in the morning, the footage showed the hallway lit only by the faint glow from the nightlight near the bathroom. Patricia appeared in frame, wearing her robe, moving quietly. She paused outside my mother's door. I watched the small screen in disbelief. She pushed the door open, stepped inside, and for a moment the sound dropped, just the flicker of the motion sensor light. Then I heard my mother's voice, soft and frightened. "Please, not again," she whispered. Patricia's voice was low, but sharp enough to cut. "If you keep spilling things, I'll have to clean them all night. Do you understand?" Then came the sound of something small clattering, maybe a cup, and a dull thud. The image shivered as though the house itself wanted to look away. I stopped the recording there. My hands shook. I sat at the kitchen table with the laptop open and the world split clean in two, before and after. My chest hurt. 45 years of shared mornings, holidays, promises, laughter, all of it seemed to collapse into that one frame of night vision green. I could have vomited. I wanted to storm into the bedroom, confront her, demand an explanation, but reason, that old, dry voice I used to keep my students from fights, whispered, "Not yet." Proof mattered. Emotion could be dismissed, evidence could not. So I copied the footage to a flash drive, labeled it with the date, and hid it in my desk drawer. The next day was a study in pretending. I buttered toast. I asked about her art group. I drove my mother to the clinic for her memory checkup. Patricia smiled, poured coffee, hummed while she watered the plants. I stared at her hands. Every movement looked suddenly foreign, choreographed by someone I didn't know. That evening, after Agnes was asleep, I told Patricia I was going for a walk to clear my head. Instead, I went to see a friend, Robert Kane, a lawyer I taught with years ago before he left teaching for law school. He still had an office above the old bakery on Main Street. I didn't tell him everything at first. I just said I suspected something was wrong at home and I needed advice on what to do if an elderly person were being mistreated by a family member. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "Edward, you wouldn't be here unless you already knew the answer." Then I showed him the video. He watched it twice, in silence, then leaned back. "You need to protect your mother first. Then we call the authorities. But be careful, don't confront Patricia alone. Document everything. Dates, times, every bruise, every word. Keep copies in more than one place." His calmness steadied me. He handed me a notepad. "Start tonight," he said. "I'll make a few calls." That night, I barely slept. I moved my mother's walker closer to her bed and locked the main door quietly after Patricia came in. My mind ran circles around the same thought. How had I missed it? How many times had she been afraid while I sat downstairs grading papers or reading the newspaper? Over the next week, I did what Robert advised. I kept a log, a simple notebook with line pages. I wrote every detail. The bruises on Tuesday, the missing mug on Wednesday, the raised voice through the vent on Friday. I placed another camera, this time hidden in the bookshelf inside my mother's room, angled toward the bed but not intrusive. The new footage removed any remaining doubt. On the second night, Patricia entered again. She scolded Agnes for wetting the sheets, something that had started happening more often since her medications changed. Patricia's tone was icy, impatient, cruelly matter-of-fact. She yanked the bedsheet roughly, and Agnes whimpered. That sound, a sound I had never heard my mother make in all her long life, felt like a knife through my chest. When I showed Robert the new clip, he didn't mince words. "This is criminal, Edward. You need to take her to a doctor and report it." The following morning, I told Patricia I was taking my mother for her scheduled checkup. She nodded distractedly, scrolling through her phone. At the clinic, I asked to see Dr. Lynn privately. She had treated my mother for years and trusted me. I told her, not everything, but enough, and asked if she could examine Agnes more thoroughly. When she saw the bruises and the faint ring mark near the wrist, her expression hardened. "Edward, I'm obligated to report this," she said. "And you should too." By that evening, a social worker and an officer from community services were at our door. They spoke with my mother first, then with me. Patricia returned home while they were still there. Her face drained when she saw the uniforms. The officer explained calmly that there had been a report of possible elder mistreatment and that they needed to ask some questions. Patricia tried to laugh it off. "She's confused. She falls all the time," but I could see the fear bloom beneath the surface. The social worker asked to see the bedroom. When they found the damp bedding and the broken mug near the nightstand, I saw the officer's jaw tighten. They didn't arrest Patricia that night. They told her an investigation would follow, that they'd need to collect evidence and take statements. Patricia left for her sister's house that evening, packing in silence. She didn't look at me as she carried the suitcase out the door. The house felt different immediately. Lighter, quieter, though the quiet carried grief. Agnes slept through the night for the first time in months. When she woke, she seemed unsure of where Patricia had gone, but calmer. I sat by her bed and read aloud from one of the old books she loved, the kind with yellowed pages and sentences that smell faintly of dust. She smiled, a small, fragile thing. Over the following days, officers came back with questions. They collected the footage, took my statement, and arranged for Agnes to stay temporarily with Pauline while they sorted legalities. It all moved faster than I expected. One moment you're keeping a notebook by lamplight, the next you're signing formal documents in a precinct office under fluorescent glare. When the case reached court several months later, Patricia's lawyer tried to paint it as stress, caregiving fatigue, mental strain. But the footage left little room for interpretation. The judge's verdict came down like a door closing, guilty of neglect and assault on a dependent adult. The sentence was not long. 2 years of supervision, mandatory counseling, community service, but it was enough to mark the truth publicly. I sat in the back row, watching the woman I had shared most of my life with stand small and rigid under the weight of her own actions. I didn't feel triumph, only a kind of quiet sorrow that so much love could erode into this. When it was over, Robert placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did what you had to," he said. "You saved your mother." He was right, I suppose. But the victory tasted like ash. When the verdict was read, the sound in the courtroom felt like silence made heavier. I remember staring at Patricia's hands, the same hands that had once fixed the torn pockets of my shirts, baked birthday cakes, held mine in hospital waiting rooms. Now, they were pale and still on the defense table, folded like paper waiting for a signature that would never come. The judge spoke evenly, without cruelty. "Mrs. Hale, this court finds you guilty on all counts of neglect and assault. You are sentenced to 2 years of community supervision, with mandatory psychological counseling and a prohibition on unsupervised caregiving of any dependent adult." The words landed softly, but they rewrote everything that had been my life. Patricia didn't look at me as she was escorted out. I watched her go with an ache that I can only describe as a fracture. Not sudden, not clean, but deep. You think you'll feel anger, maybe even relief, but what came instead was grief for the person she had been before this darkness crept in. When the case ended, I took my mother home from Pauline's condominium. Pauline had done her best, new blankets, vitamins lined neatly on the counter, but she confessed that caring for her grandmother had been harder than she'd expected. It makes you realize how strong Mom must have been before. She stopped, unsure of how to finish the thought. I told her she didn't have to. Some silences deserve to remain untied. Back in Lakeshore, the house felt both familiar and strange. The air had changed. No shouting, no tension humming beneath conversations. Just quiet, honest quiet. I spent the first few days cleaning, not because it needed it, but because movement felt easier than stillness. I washed the curtains, scrubbed the floors, threw out anything that smelled like the past. Patricia's half-finished watercolors, her coffee mug, the robe she used to wear on winter mornings. Each item carried a pulse of memory, and with each one gone, the house seemed to breathe a little easier. Agnes, for her part, began to mend. Her bruises faded to soft yellow. She ate better. The tremor in her hands lessened. She even laughed once properly, the kind of laugh that comes from deep in the chest. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I'd heard it. We settled into a new rhythm. Mornings with oatmeal and crosswords. Afternoons with the radio humming softly in the kitchen. But healing, I learned, isn't neat. The mind lags behind the body. Some nights, she still wakes with a start, whispering apologies into the dark. When I rush to her room, she looks at me with the wide, unfocused eyes of someone who isn't sure which world she's in. I tell her she's safe. I tell her Patricia isn't here. Sometimes she believes me right away. Sometimes she doesn't. Those are the nights that hurt the most. I started therapy too, on Robert's suggestion. The counselor, a gentle woman named Mira, told me that guilt is common in cases like mine. "You weren't blind, Edward," she said. "You were human. Love delays recognition." I wanted to argue, to insist that I should have known sooner, that I could have stopped everything before it began. But she was right. You can't unlive what you trusted. The months passed. Seasons shifted. Spring came with a cautious kind of beauty. The maples outside the house turned green again, the river filled with ducks. Agnes took to sitting on the porch in the afternoons, wrapped in her shawl, watching the light move across the street. She'd nod at passers-by, sometimes wave. It wasn't happiness exactly, but it was peace, a quieter, more durable form of it. Patricia wrote once from her program, a letter, long and uncertain. She apologized, said she didn't understand what had come over her, blamed stress, depression, burnout. She asked if, someday, she might be allowed to see Agnes again, just to say sorry. I read it 3 times and then placed it in the drawer beneath the old camera. I didn't reply. There are wounds that forgiveness doesn't seal, it only names them. One afternoon, I found myself replaying the first video again, not to punish myself, but to remember why I had to act. It was shorter than I remembered, barely 40 seconds, but it held everything: fear, power, silence, truth. Watching it, I realized something unexpected. It wasn't hatred that had driven me to expose Patricia. It was love. Love for my mother, yes, but also for the man I wanted to remain. To ignore it would have meant abandoning both. That night, I sat with Agnes and told her gently that Patricia had been sentenced. She listened quietly, her face unreadable. When I finished, she nodded and said only, "You did right." Then she reached for my hand. "I'm proud of you, Eddie," she said. The same words she'd used when I was a boy who'd brought home good grades. It broke something open in me, and I cried. Not the quick kind of tears that end with a sigh, but the long, shaking kind that remind you you're still alive. In the weeks that followed, I began writing down everything that had happened, not as evidence, but as a kind of record. Maybe someday Pauline will read it, or her children will. I want them to know that love is not blind obedience, that protection sometimes means standing against the people you once trusted most. Life, in its quiet way, began to rebuild itself. I joined a local support group for family caregivers. Every Thursday, a handful of us, men and women in our 60s, 70s, some younger, sit in a circle at the community center, sharing stories of frustration, devotion, exhaustion. We laugh more than you'd expect. There's a strange solidarity in admitting the hard parts. When newcomers arrive, nervous and ashamed, I tell them what Mira told me. Love delays recognition, but it doesn't erase responsibility. One evening, after the meeting, a woman came up to me and said, "My brother's looking after our father. I think something's wrong, but I'm afraid to check." I told her gently, "If you're afraid, you already know. Document what you can. Talk to someone. Don't wait for permission to care." She nodded, tears in her eyes. That conversation stayed with me. Now, when I look back at the last year, I see it less as a story of betrayal and more as one of difficult courage, the kind that doesn't feel like bravery while you're living it. If I'd done nothing, my mother might have vanished inside her fear. By acting, I lost a marriage but kept my integrity. It's a cruel trade, but a necessary one. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the echo of Patricia's laughter from years ago when things were good. I let it come. Memories aren't enemies. They're weather. They pass through. Before I finish this story, I want to say something for anyone who finds themselves in a position like mine. If you notice the small things, a bruise, a tremor, a silence that shouldn't be there, don't explain them away. Don't wait for proof that your heart already knows. Record, report, protect. It's not betrayal to seek the truth. It's the only way to stay human. The morning after the trial, when the sun rose over the river, I stood at the window with my coffee and watched the light touch the water. For the first time in many months, I didn't feel dread. Just tired gratitude that my mother was safe, that I had done something difficult and right. I thought of the message I'd once sent my lawyer in that hospital waiting room. Phase 1 is complete. Maybe in some way, this was phase 2, rebuilding, forgiving myself, learning to live in a house that had seen both harm and healing. And as I watched Agnes pour herself a cup of tea, steady and unhurried, I whispered softly, "We made it, Mom." She looked up, smiled, and for a moment, the world felt gentle again. Let's see. It's been over a year since everything ended, or began, depending on how you look at it. I'm sitting now in the same living room where all this started. The afternoon light pours through the old curtains, carrying that pale golden hue that softens everything it touches. The house smells faintly of cinnamon and polish. Agnes is asleep in the next room, her breathing slow and even. There's peace in the air, the kind that doesn't demand attention but simply exists. I think often about how fragile perception can be, how easily the familiar blinds us. Patricia wasn't a monster. She was a woman worn thin by duty and disappointment. I've come to believe that neglect doesn't always stem from cruelty. Sometimes it grows out of exhaustion that's been ignored for too long. But acknowledging that truth doesn't excuse it. The harm still counts. The bruises still mattered. And the silence between those moments was still a kind of violence. I once thought forgiveness meant welcoming someone back. I know better now. Forgiveness, I've learned, can simply mean letting go of the weight of wanting revenge. It's understanding that the past cannot be rebuilt, but it can be faced without bitterness. Patricia's name hasn't been spoken much in this house since the trial. Pauline calls sometimes, updating me on her mother's progress in therapy. Apparently, Patricia's doing better, volunteering at a local shelter, cooking for the elderly there. I listen quietly, grateful that she's found something good to build from the wreckage. But I don't ask to see her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Agnes turned 92 last month. We held a small gathering, just family and two of her oldest friends from church. She wore a lilac dress that Pauline had chosen and insisted on cutting her own cake. When everyone had gone home, she sat on the couch beside me and said, "It's strange, Eddie. I used to think growing old meant losing everything. But I still have you." I told her that was enough for me, too. Sometimes I reread the journal I kept during those months. The entries filled with confusion, guilt, rage. I see now how grief was threaded through every decision. Losing trust feels almost like mourning a death. You bury not just the person they were, but the version of yourself that believed they never could harm anyone. But that burial, painful as it is, makes room for new growth. I began speaking at local workshops, small groups mostly, at libraries or community halls. The sessions are titled When Care Hurts, Recognizing Hidden Abuse in Families. I start by telling them about a bruise I nearly ignored, about the day I pointed my phone toward the truth. Then I pause. I look around the room, and I see faces like mine, tired, uncertain, wanting to do right but afraid of what right might cost. I tell them it's okay to feel afraid. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that someone's safety matters more than your comfort. After one session, an older man came up to me, his voice trembling. He said, "I've been looking after my wife for 8 years. She yells at me when she's confused, throws things. Sometimes I think she hates me, but I can't tell anyone because they'll think I'm weak." I placed a hand on his shoulder and told him what I wish someone had told me. You're not weak for feeling broken. You're human for staying when it's hard. But don't let love become a cage. Get help before it turns into harm. Each story I hear reminds me that what happened in my house isn't unique. It's repeated quietly, behind closed doors in countless homes, where care and cruelty overlap until even the kindest intentions start to rot. That's why I keep talking, because silence protects no one. I often think about that night in the hospital, my shirt stained and my mind spinning with disbelief. I had sent that text, Phase 1 is complete, without knowing what Phase 2 would look like. At the time, it was just a code to keep my fear from spilling out. Now I understand it better. Phase 1 was survival. Phase 2 is awareness. Phase 3, the one I'm living now, is responsibility. It means using what I know to make sure others don't wait as long as I did. Some evenings, after the dishes are done and the house is quiet, I sit with a glass of tea and scroll through old photographs. Pauline as a toddler, Patricia painting by the window, my mother in her garden surrounded by sunflowers. It's strange how pictures can hold both pain and tenderness. The same image that once made me ache now feels like proof that life was beautiful before it became complicated, and that it can be beautiful again after. I've stopped asking myself whether I did the right thing. That question used to haunt me. But the truth is simple. Doing the right thing doesn't always feel right in the moment. Sometimes it feels like loss, sometimes like loneliness. But if you can live with your reflection afterward, then you chose well. Last week, I received a letter from Patricia again. This one was shorter. She wrote that she understood if I never wanted to speak to her again, but she wanted me to know she'd finally forgiven herself. She thanked me, not sarcastically, but with the quiet humility of someone who's walked through fire and survived. I folded the letter and placed it beside the first one. I still didn't write back, but I whispered, "I forgive you too," into the empty room. That was enough. Agnes' health is fragile, but her spirit hasn't dimmed. Every morning, she asks me to open the curtains so she can check on the world. She says she likes to see who's walking their dogs or which neighbor got a new car. It's such a small thing, yet it feels sacred, the desire to stay connected to life. Watching her, I realize that care at its truest isn't about control. It's about witness. It's standing beside someone as they fade and saying, "You still matter." I'll end this story with what I tell the people who come to my talks, those who sit there clutching their doubts like secrets they're too afraid to name. If you ever suspect that someone you love is being hurt, even quietly, even subtly, don't wait for the proof to become unbearable. Trust your instincts. Document gently. Speak carefully, but act. Because time doesn't heal what's hidden, it only hardens it. And if you're the one carrying guilt for seeing too late, forgive yourself. We all miss things the first time around. What defines you isn't the delay, but what you do once you finally see. As for me, I'm just an old man with a story that started with disbelief and ended with understanding. I don't seek redemption, only peace. The kind that comes from knowing I faced the truth, however late, and protected the one who needed me most. Sometimes, when the day winds down and the sky turns that soft, bruised pink, Agnes will call from her room, "Eddie, are you there?" And I'll answer, "Always, Mom." Because I am. And maybe that's what all of this was really about, learning what always means. Let's see. She pushed her porridge around the bowl, said she wasn't hungry, and sometimes seemed afraid when Patricia entered the room. The first few times I noticed it, I told myself we were all under strain. We were, after all, adjusting. But the unease kept coming in small, specific acts. One evening, in late December, while Patricia was at a meeting with her art group, Agnes shuffled into the kitchen with her walker and asked me a question that unclothed the house in a way I couldn't unsee. "Do you think your wife likes me being here?" she said, voice low, hands folded so tightly I could see the tremor along her knuckles. It was such a small question. I told her, as every decent son would, that of course she was welcome, that Patricia had said it was her idea to bring her in. She nodded, but her eyes didn't meet mine. "Sometimes I think I get in the way," she whispered. I smoothed her hand. "Not in the least," I said, because it was true as far as I understood. But a tiny seed of doubt found root in the dark of me. The first visible sign that something more than existential strain was happening came one January morning after a night of heavy snow. I had been up early to clear the drive. When I went upstairs to check on Agnes, she was still in bed, unusual for someone who had always risen with the day. I knocked lightly. "Agnes, are you awake?" She called back, a smear of sleep in her voice. Sitting on the corner of her bed, she looked more fragile than usual. Hair mussed, face a little too gaunt. When she reached to push hair from her forehead, I saw the bruise. It was on her forearm, just below the elbow, a deep purple, like the thumbprint of some angry hand. There were others, smaller, a constellation of marks along her shoulder. "Did you fall?" I asked before I could think of anything more tactful. She tucked the arm beneath the blanket and said, "I bumped against the door." I'm so clumsy, but the way she said it, so quick to shut the question down, told me more than her words did. I had seen too many injuries in the years I taught and in the way men and women accidentally harmed themselves in ordinary life. This did not look accidental. Patricia was already dressed for work, loading a travel mug with coffee and checking messages on her phone. When I mentioned the bruise, she blinked as if surprised and said, with that casual economy of someone who had places to be, "Oh, people bruise when they're old." She probably doesn't remember how she did it. Then she kissed my cheek, grabbed her keys, and left. I stood by the kitchen window, watching the door close, feeling a small, insistent cold where certainty should have been. From that point, I started paying attention in a way that turned me into the kind of observer I had sometimes been in the classroom, present but quiet, watching expression, counting the number of times a hand hesitated. Agnes began to flinch when Patricia entered a room. When Patricia spoke to her, Agnes often answered in a small, shrunken voice, as if apologizing for occupying space. Once I walked into the kitchen and found Patricia standing over Agnes at the table, leaning in so close the older woman's shoulders crooped beneath the pressure. Patricia's face was hard and quick with something I could not name. When she saw me, the mask folded into its familiar smile and voice. "Just checking she took her meds," she said, light and ordinary. Agnes's hands shook as she lifted the pill bottle. I tried to talk myself out of the dread. Maybe Patricia was tired, overwhelmed. Maybe the move had been harder on her than on me. I'd lost Aaron. Grief did strange things. I wanted to believe in the person I had married. But then there were the nights. I would lie awake next to Patricia in the dark, listening. I began to notice a pattern. Mornings when Agnes seemed particularly exhausted. Mornings when fresh bruises appeared like new, insolent stamps. Sleep did not hide what I was beginning to suspect. It kept it. The house would be quiet, a good quiet, and then an edge would cut through my contentment. I started to consider possibilities that frightened me. What if her fear was not the product of confusion? What if someone in this house, someone whose voice I knew like the back of my hand, was the cause? I did not want to imagine it. 45 years of marriage, the woman who'd sewn my shirts back together after the accident when I was 30, who'd held my hand in the hospital and promised we would be okay after Aaron, who'd laugh with me late in the night about things only the two of us would find funny. The idea felt preposterous. But the marks were real. Agnes's withdrawal was real. My not knowing felt like complicity. That was where I lived for the weeks that followed. In a taut pause between loving memory and a fear that some part of my life had become dangerous. I started to notice other things, too. The way Patricia would take laundry upstairs and close the door on small pretexts. The way she sometimes came down late at night, smelling faintly of alcohol, even though she did not drink much. Little details like coins in the jar scraped together into a pattern. I was a man who had spent many years teaching students how to read sources and notice bias. I was learning now how to read the people in my own home. And then, one night, something tipped the balance between suspicion and action. I didn't want to be a man who relied on feeling alone. I wanted to know. I wanted proof that could not be smoothed away by denials and explanations. I wanted to be able to look Agnes in the eye and tell her I had seen for myself. So I did the thing I had never imagined doing in my own house. I bought a small camera and decided to see what happened when I was asleep.